You know, I've spoken in many places at many times, but I have never received a reception like this, and I thank you very, very much for that. Before I talk about the media and the slobbering love affair that they've been carrying on with Barack Obama, there's something I noticed in one of the local papers in the area this morning, one of the advice columns that you read from time to time, that I thought I'd share with you since it has something to do with the media. This was a Dear Ann letter in today's paper. It says, "Dear Ann, I have a problem. I have two brothers. One brother is in television news and the other was put to death in the electric chair for murder. My mother died from insanity when I was 3 years old. My sisters are prostitutes and my father sells narcotics to high school students. Recently, I met a girl who was just released from a reformatory where she served time for smothering her illegitimate child to death, and I want to marry her. My problem is, if I marry this girl, should I tell her about my brother who's in television news?" That sort of sets the stage. By the way, I've been thinking for the past hour or so whether I should read this second letter, which I will tell you right now has nothing to do with what we're here for tonight, but I'm going to share. I'm going to take a chance. If this doesn't work, the speech is going to end in about 2 minutes, but I'm going to take a chance. Did you ever wonder why there are no men who write advice columns? They're all women, right? There's a reason for this. Here's the reason. This is a column. There's one guy out there. His name is Robert. This is a letter. "Dear Robert, I hope you can help me. The other day, I set off for work, leaving my husband in the house watching the TV as usual. I hadn't gone more than a mile down the road when my car engine conked out and the car shuddered to a halt. I walked back home to get my husband's help. When I got home, I couldn't believe my eyes. He was in the bedroom with a neighbor lady. He was let go from his job 6 months ago, and he says he has been feeling increasingly depressed and worthless. I love him very much, but he has become increasingly distant. I don't feel I can get through to him anymore. Can you please help me? Sincerely, Sheila." And this is why there are no... It says, "Dear Sheila, a car stalling after being driven a short distance can be caused by a variety of faults with the engine. Start by checking that there's no debris in the fuel line. If it's clear, check the Jubilee clips holding the vacuum pipes onto the inlet manifold. If none of these approaches solves the problem, it could be that the fuel pump itself is faulty, causing low delivery pressure to the carburetor flow chamber. I hope this helps." Thank you. All right. Just now let's talk about the book and about the media. Just before I came here, I found out from some of my sources in Washington that right after Barack Obama became president, right after, he learned that the economy was in even worse shape than he had thought, and in order to save money, he was forced to lay off 17 journalists. Now, why does that joke work? Because, like most jokes that work, there's an air of believability to it. Okay, how much believability? Well, the Pew Research Center, which is one of those down-the-middle, nonpartisan groups, took a poll at the end of the campaign, right near the end of the campaign, and they asked registered voters a simple, easy-to-understand question. Who do you think most reporters want to win this election? 90% of Republicans said the media wants Barack Obama to win. Let's forget that. We expect that. But 62% of Democrats, and coincidentally another 62% of independents, said the exact same thing. So just about everybody gets it. Just about everybody out there understands that the media was in the tank for Barack Obama. This doesn't mean, by the way, that everybody cares that the media was in the tank for Barack Obama. the more you supported him, the more passionate you were in wanting him to be elected, the less you care about the fact that the media was corrupt this time around. And every now and then when I'm on a radio show and a liberal caller calls in, and even if he or she acknowledges the bias, expresses a lack of interest in it, doesn't care, I came up with this analogy that let's imagine we have two college football teams. You could pick any two teams, but let's say USC and Notre Dame. And for whatever reason, the referees wanted Notre Dame to win. Whatever reason. Notre Dame had higher academic standards. Notre Dame had more players who overcame physical hardships. I don't care what the reasons are. But they decided that anytime there was a close call, they were going to go in Notre Dame's favor. Nobody would tolerate that. Nobody would tolerate that. I don't even think the Notre Dame fans would tolerate that. And I use that analogy to make the point that the media, reporters and their editors, are supposed to be impartial referees. And they're supposed to tell us what's going on and let us decide. And it doesn't matter if you were rooting for Barack Obama. You can't have a media that's in the tank for one candidate. It is bad for everybody. And when I say everybody, I don't just mean it's bad for Republicans and conservatives. It's bad for Democrats and liberals as well, and I'm going to explain that in a bit. I want to make very clear before I get into this too deeply that this is not an anti-Barack Obama book. I don't blame him one bit for accepting all the slobbering and all the adulation that was aimed in his direction. I mean, most of us would take advantage of adulation if somebody heaped it on us. But it very much is an anti-mainstream media book. This time, it was different from all the other times. This time, I'm not even talking about media bias. This time, they went to a new level, from media bias to media activism, which is sort of like judicial activism, where judges know what's best for everybody and then decide to legislate from the bench. Media activism is where reporters decided that they knew what was best for everyone. And they were going to not only put a thumb on the scale the way they always do for a liberal Democratic candidate, whether it was Dukakis or Mondale or John Kerry, this was different. This time they didn't put a thumb on the scale. This time they sat on the damn scale and they didn't care if any of you noticed or what you thought about it. Because this time it was different. They weren't happy simply being even partisan eyewitnesses to history. This time they wanted to help shape history because this time they were on a noble mission. In their mind, they were on a noble mission. This time there was historical importance to the election. So they threw out their impartiality, and as I say, they didn't care who knew it. Now, it's not enough to simply make accusations like this without giving specifics. So let me tell you what I wrote in the book, and then I'm going to give you some specifics. This is a line from the book. If you didn't notice the pro-Obama bias during the campaign, you were either dead or in a coma. If you were dead, there's no reason to continue reading. Assuming most of you here tonight are alive, let me give you a few examples. And you know, you really can't make this stuff up. There was the commentator on MSNBC who said that when he heard Barack Obama speak, he got a thrill running up his leg. Okay. Commentators are allowed to comment, but this isn't commentary. This is a man crush. The same commentator went on The Tonight Show and said, if you're actually in the room when Obama gives one of his speeches and you don't cry, you're not an American. Now, while we're on the subject of MSNBC, when Sarah Palin was announced as the Republican vice presidential nominee, this was on MSNBC during the day, not on one of their nighttime commentary shows. a graphic went up on the screen as she was being announced as the candidate, and it said, "Breaking news, how many houses will Palin add to the Republican ticket?" This is when John McCain was asked about how many houses. Now, this wasn't on the Jon Stewart make-believe comedy news show. This was on MSNBC, a division of NBC News, during the day, again, not during one of their commentary shows. Okay. Then there was the article in Newsweek in which they said Barack Obama was, this is a quote, "tall and handsome and blessed with a weighty baritone." This gets a little creepy for my taste. There was the New York Times story that compared Barack Obama to both JFK and Martin Luther King in the same paragraph. There was the NBC News correspondent who was assigned to cover Barack Obama, who said that it's almost hard to maintain your objectivity while covering Obama because the excitement that he engendered was so infectious. There was a story that appeared on Christmas morning on page 1 of the Washington Post about Barack Obama's exercise regimen. Here's one sentence from the story. "The sun glinted off chiseled pectorals, sculpted during 4 weightlifting sessions each week, and a body toned by regular treadmill runs and basketball games." This is the kind of stuff you'd expect to read in a romance novel with Fabio on the cover. Not page 1 of the most important newspaper in the nation's capital and one of the 2 or 3 most important in the country. Now, if you think I'm cherry picking these goofy examples to make a point, I'm not. The book has, I won't bore you with statistics, but the book has a number of impartial studies, again, nonpartisan groups, that make very clear that the media coverage was way more positive for Barack Obama than John McCain, and at the same time, way more negative of John McCain than of Barack Obama. I should point out, though, that in fairness, that one of the authors of one of the studies said that, yes, the media did tilt in Barack Obama's favor, but it wasn't for ideological reasons. It was, and I'm using his words, it was because Obama was leading the polls and winning begets winning coverage. Really? Winning didn't beget winning coverage when Ronald Reagan carried 49 states. He was called the amiable dunce. Winning didn't beget winning coverage when Newt Gingrich led a conservative revolution. In 1994, he was on the cover of news magazines as the Gingrich who stole Christmas. So I'm not buying this winning begets winning coverage nonsense for 1 second. And even if it was the reason, even if we, to be generous, say, well, maybe winning does beget winning coverage, let's assume a congressional race once upon a time between David Duke and Martin Luther King. It's not hard to imagine in some places at a certain time David Duke leading in the polls. Does any decent person think that if David Duke were leading Martin Luther King, David Duke should get favorable coverage in the media because winning begets winning coverage? It's just a nonsense argument that we shouldn't take seriously, and I'm only mentioning it to get it off the table. Because when you get down to it, it really comes down to a simple understanding of what the press is there for. It's there to give us the facts. It's there to tell us what's going on. It really is there to be the impartial referee and let us decide. The American people are not that stupid. Just give us the facts and let us decide. I don't think it's that complicated. Partway through the campaign, to show you how crazy it got, a mysterious mental disorder broke out in some places in America, including the media. And it happened, interestingly, right after Sarah Palin was put on the Republican ticket. It was a mental disorder that came to be known as PDS, Palin Derangement Syndrome. whether you like Sarah Palin or not, and I understand that there are some people who think she's great and some people who aren't too fond of her, whether you like her or not, there was nothing that she did that deserved the viciousness with which she was attacked. I want to give you some examples. A female professor at the University of Chicago wrote on the Washington Post website that Sarah Palin's greatest hypocrisy is her pretense that she is a woman. You see, just as liberals, not all liberals, but many elite liberals, just as they don't see black conservatives as black people at all, but simply as conservatives, they don't see women conservatives as women. They didn't see Sarah Palin as a woman. They saw her only as a conservative. At least that writer did. Another professor, this one from the University of Michigan, wrote a piece for Salon, which is the liberal online magazine, very influential in some liberal circles. The writer asked, "What's the difference between Palin and a Muslim fundamentalist?" Lipstick. Okay, ha ha, I can't stop laughing. We all get the joke. Except, if you think about it, Muslim fundamentalists do very bad things to you if they don't like you. Sarah Palin wouldn't do any of those kinds of things. So that's another thing. And also on Salon, another woman writer said that Sarah Palin is such a power-mad backwater beauty pageant casualty, it's easy to write her off and make fun of her. But in reality, I'm glad you're all sitting down for this. In reality, I feel as horrified as a ghetto Jew watching the rise of National Socialism. So the rise of Sarah Palin was akin to the rise of Nazism in Germany. Somebody please call Jerry Lewis. We need a telethon to raise money to fight this disease. One of the more corrupt examples of before I get to solutions, I want to give you another example of how the media went way beyond what it normally does and how it corrupted itself. There were, late in the campaign, in October, late in October actually, the New York Times ran 2 page one profiles of the potential first ladies, Mrs. Michelle Obama and Cindy McCain. And as I write in the book, in late October, as the campaign was nearing the finish line, the New York Times ran profiles of the candidates' wives. One had all the pathos of a Greek tragedy. The other was as sunny as happy days. Guess which was which? Okay, in the profile of Mrs. McCain, here's what we discover. We discover that way back in 1982, when she first came to Washington, some congressional wives didn't like her. We learned that Cindy McCain didn't like Washington. We learned that she worried about not fitting in. We learned that from time to time, her parents bought her gifts on behalf of John McCain because he was too busy or too uncaring to buy them himself. We were reminded of her long ago addiction to painkillers. We were told that she doesn't always tell the truth. And as Byron York put it in the National Review, in what sense are these revelations, if true, newsworthy? And when you are doing a story about the wife of a candidate, do those big scoops justify the intrusiveness required to discover them? I think that's a good question. What about the profile of Michelle Obama? Well, we get a quote from David Axelrod, who is the political campaign guru and a longtime family friend, that Mrs. Obama is, quote, very, very smart and sensitive. We're told that when she speaks at a rally, quote, the audience roars with delight, and that her primary role is mom-in-chief. Mark Halperin of Time magazine, who is absolutely a mainstream journalist, he's not some right-wing, anybody, he said the profile of Michelle Obama was a front-page endorsement of what a great person Michelle Obama is. Here's why this is important. Just a few weeks earlier, the executive editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, was at a conference, a media conference in New York City. And he was asked about, what do you do when McCain protests to the New York Times about your coverage? And what the questioner was referring to was the page one story in the New York Times earlier in the campaign about McCain hinting, I want to be fair, alleging, hinting, suggesting is the best word, suggesting that John McCain might have been having an affair with a female lobbyist. This story, by the way, was based on 2 unnamed sources, right? So Bill Keller, the guy who runs the New York Times, is asked about this, and I want you to listen carefully to what his answer was. He said, "My first tendency when they do that is to find the toughest McCain story we've got and put it on the front page just to show them that they can't get away with it." Now, I'm not saying that's why the New York Times ran a dark and gloomy and depressing story of Michelle Obama on page one. But you know what? It might be. It might be. So what can we do about this to try to make things better? First, we have to acknowledge that there's no conspiracy at work here. There isn't. I worked at CBS News for 28 years. I know what I'm talking about. Katie Couric, Brian Williams, Charlie Gibson, in my day, Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, they never came in the morning. Summoned their top lieutenants, went into a room, turned the lights down, pulled the shades, gave the secret handshake and the secret salute, and said either, how are we going to screw those conservatives, or more recently, what can we do today to help get Barack Obama elected? It doesn't happen that way. I wish it did, because that is so unacceptable that nobody would tolerate it once they found out about it. What happens is worse, and because it's institutional bias, it's built into the fabric of what they do, so that you have a newsroom filled with like-minded people. And you have too many like-minded people in one room, and you have groupthink that starts to take over. And these people believe that everything to the right of center is conservative, which it is, and everything to the left of center is middle of the road. Really. Everything to the left of center is reasonable. It's civil. It just makes sense, because these media elites live in a comfy liberal bubble where they can go for a day, a month, a year. They can go a lifetime and practically never run into anybody who has a different point of view on any of the major subjects, the major hot issues of our time. So in their own crazy way, they sort of think that, well, sort of everybody decent anyway, everybody who's got any brains anyway, thinks the way they do. That's how bias and eventually activism, media activism, come about. It's sort of like, there was a George Clinton song, and nobody knows who George Clinton is here, but he was called the king of funkadelic music back in the 70s. Well, he had a line in a song that said, "Fish don't know he's wet." Well, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. How would a fish know he's wet? The fish has no frame of reference. Well, it's sort of like that with liberal journalists in newsrooms. They don't have a frame of reference. They don't know that their views, I know you're not going to believe this, but I'm telling you, I worked with these people for 28 years. They don't know that their views are liberal. As I say, they think they're reasonable, and they certainly think they're middle of the road. So, by the way, this is important. On the rare occasions when they acknowledge their bias, and they do sometimes, they will tell you that they don't care. 3 days after the election, 2 heavyweight journalists, political journalists inside the Beltway, you won't know their names because they're not on television a lot, but they're very well-respected political journalists, Charlie Cook and Stuart Rothenberg, were at a seminar in Washington 3 days after the election, and they were talking about the press's coverage, and Cook said, I think a lot of people in the news media were too young to cover Camelot and John Kennedy. They were too young in most cases to cover Bobby Kennedy, and so I think they were starstruck by this Obama phenomenon. And then he said, let's face it, is there a Democratic and a liberal bias in the media? Of course there is. Okay? Then Rothenberg said, I'm sure journalists preferred Obama. They liked Obama. They're Democrats. Obama got better treatment. So they're acknowledging their bias, right? What I call their activism. But it gets worse than that. Rothenberg then says, but you know, it is what it is. It's the nature of the political environment. Republicans ought to know that. And then his friend Charlie Cook chimes in, as Stu said, it is what it is. Now, it is what it is. It's just a few words, and I couldn't figure out why I was so unsettled by these few words. It just bothered me in a way I couldn't define why I was so troubled by it. And then a few days later it hit me. I couldn't think of any other kind of bias where any decent person would write it off so cavalierly with the phrase, it is what it is. No decent person would ever say, well, we're not going to hire, she's a woman, we're not going to hire her, but hey, it is what it is. You know, or I know that black guy is hungry, but he can't eat at the lunch counter. Hey, but it is what it is. Now, I understand that the analogy goes just so far. Nothing, for example, is the same as race in America, but I trust that you get the point. That they just, without any concern, acknowledged their biases, or at least the media's biases, and then simply said, it is what it is. Well, you know what? It is what it is just isn't good enough anymore. We need a journalist or two who has the guts to stand up and say, it is what it is, will not cut it anymore. That's how I feel about it. But since I'm not holding my breath, I came up with my own solutions. You ready? Affirmative action. I used to joke about this. I used to say it just to tweak my friends on the left. I'm not joking anymore. We need an affirmative action program for the smallest group, the smallest minority in the American newsroom, conservatives. Because after decades of diversity, here's what we've wound up with. We've wound up with male conservatives and we've wound up with male liberals and female liberals, black liberals and white liberals, gay liberals and straight liberals, Latino liberals and Asian liberals. That's all fine as far as it goes. But we need newsrooms that not only look like America, but that think a little more like America. Now, I should tell you that I would tell these people, these conservatives that we brought in, keep your conservative opinions to yourself, because I don't want to hear about them. And I would tell the liberals the same thing. But at least you would have a different perspective. That's why we went out and found women and black people and other minorities, not because we had evidence of rampant racism among white males, but because you can't get news from simply white males. That's not a healthy thing. They know just so much. I say they. We know just so much. You need other perspectives. Well, you need conservatives in the newsroom, even if they're never giving their opinion, to have that perspective represented in the newsroom. Now, despite what I've been telling you about how hard the media tried to elect Barack Obama because of his historical significance, I want to make something very clear. And I know I'm speaking truth to power in this group. The media did not defeat John McCain. They tried, but they didn't defeat John McCain. John McCain defeated John McCain. If you put up the two candidates on a split television screen. One of them was yesterday, the other one was tomorrow. And the American people rarely vote for yesterday. George Bush defeated John McCain. Immensely unpopular, got us into a very long war, and however it turns out, and we all pray that it turns out well, the American people do not like long wars. The Republican Party defeated John McCain. They took power in the year 2000. They had the White House and both houses of Congress, and they were the grown-ups. They were the fiscally responsible ones, and they spent money like Imelda Marcos in a shoe store. And President Bush didn't veto a single bill. History defeated John McCain. The American people almost never elect the same party 3 times in a row. And in the end, the financial meltdown was the final nail in that coffin. He couldn't recover from that. So if the media, in the end, didn't defeat John McCain, you could ask, why should we care how they behaved? Because the only reason Thomas Jefferson and the boys gave the media constitutional protections with no checks and balances is because they were supposed to keep an eye on a very powerful government to protect all of us. And that gets back to my earlier point. That's why liberals and Democrats should care as much as everybody in this room tonight. But if nobody trusts the media, and remember that Pew Research statistic I gave you, 90% of Republicans don't believe the media played fair this time, and 62% of Democrats and independents don't think they played fair either. So what happens when the media watchdog barks? Nobody's going to pay attention, and then we're all in trouble. And when I say all, I want you to understand what I mean by all. I mean all. I mean Democrats as well as Republicans, liberals as well as conservatives. Let me read, if I might, from the very end of my book about this very point. The Grim Reaper is knocking on the mainstream media's door, and they remain gloriously oblivious. They have reached a tipping point but refuse to believe it. The corrosion that is eating away at their credibility has been happening slowly. It's like acid rain. One day you look around and all the trees are dead. Nobody pays attention until it's too late. And when they become so irrelevant that no one listens to them anymore, they undoubtedly will lash out at their critics for poisoning the well. They will remain arrogant and clueless and blame the media bashers for damaging their standing with the public. But their demise won't come from the outside. It will be an inside job, the result of one too many self-inflicted wounds. When that day comes, it will be very bad indeed for the mainstream media. Pray that their demise doesn't also lead to ours. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Goldberg has agreed to take some questions, so if you want to raise your hand, I'll come over with the microphone. While I'm heading over here, I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the Fairness Doctrine?
Yeah.
And tell us what
There's
you
a
think?
chapter in the book called the Unfairness Doctrine. Let me give you a slightly longer answer here because this is interesting. Barack Obama said during the campaign he has no interest in, does everybody know what the Fairness Doctrine is? It would in effect gut conservative talk radio by forcing station owners to put on liberal shows that don't make any money and don't get any ratings. Barack Obama said he's against this. You watch. It's good. Liberals in Congress are not going to let this one go away. They'll come at it from a different direction. They'll call it local content, which means after a conservative show, a local group can come on and give their liberal opinions. Can you say Acorn, by the way? And this will be the exact same thing as the Fairness Doctrine, but it'll have a different name. Now, here's why they don't really want fairness. They want to stifle conservative voices. The only place in the media landscape, when you get right down to it, that's dominated by conservatives is talk radio. if they really wanted fairness, and the Fairness Doctrine applies to the public airwaves, they would say, well, in this book, for instance, there are lots of impartial studies that show that the media was far more favorable towards Barack Obama than John McCain. Does the Fairness Doctrine that they envision mean going to ABC, NBC, and CBS and saying, you have to balance your pro-Obama feelings with pro-McCain feelings? No, that's not what they're talking about. When Barack Obama went overseas, all three anchors went along with him. That added stature to that trip. All three network anchors going along. When John McCain went over, none of them went along. Does the Fairness Doctrine that the liberals in Congress envision, does that mean that they're going to go and force the three anchors, out of fairness, to go along with a Republican when he goes overseas? Of course not. That's not what they mean by fairness. They mean only one. And by the way, it's not about fairness at all. It's about unfairness, and it's about power. They have the power now, and they want to stifle voices of dissent. And I'm telling you, it's not over. Barack Obama put a nail in something called the Fairness Doctrine, but that doesn't mean it won't come around in some other form, and I think it will.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. Thank you so much. I think everybody here probably agrees you're right. They don't really care about being fair, the media. And you say that liberals should also care about the media not being fair, but they don't. I mean, my response I get from every liberal I talk to is, it's great, we won.
That's right.
You were just sore loser.
That's right. Oh, you're absolutely right.
How do you fix that?
And that's why I came up with this really simple analogy with the referees. Would they think it was okay if the referees had a real good reason to root for one team over the other? Would that be okay? Of course not. And my liberal friends who I speak to about this, who don't care either, they don't care. They need to care, because if you have a mainstream media that people don't have faith in, and even Democrats and independents don't have faith in the media, what happens if a bad guy comes along, a demagogue? I mean a demagogue. I don't mean George Wallace or even Huey Long, some real bad guy. What if he comes along and the first thing he does, and I quote, you know who Pat Caddell is? Pat Caddell he's the pundit, but he used to work for Jimmy Carter and George McGovern. Pat Caddell is quoted in the book saying, what happens when that demagogue comes along and looks out at the crowd and says, his first campaign speech, and says, you see those people over there? See them? See those cameras? They're the media. They're out to stop me. Do you know why? Because they're out to stop you. Everybody's going to believe it. And then the demagogue will get away with murder. That's why liberals should care. That's not just the opening of a movie. That could happen in this country. And liberals need to care as much as anybody else cares. We're all in this together. We all need a strong, fair mainstream media. But they are going down the drain, and they're bringing it on themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg, for speaking with us. Why don't we have our own media? I've always wondered, we have our own universities, we have our own structure. Why they seem to have the liberal media in the tank?
Well, there's
Why not
Fox.
begin our own?
There is Fox,
We
which
do.
tilts right, no question
But
about
that's
that.
wavering at times.
But you know, I mean, there are other countries that have systems where the media doesn't pretend to be down the middle. I mean, they represent different political points of view. Well, it may come to that. I mean, some people think that at least one of the three so-called mainstream networks was in the tank big time for Barack Obama and remains so. But cable certainly is that way. Cable certainly is that way. I would prefer that the media straighten out itself, get its act together, do what the Founding Fathers envisioned when they gave them constitutional protections with no checks and balances, and be fair. It's not asking too much to be fair. But when you have so many people in journalism who are left of center, and that's not a shot. Every poll ever taken where they self-identify, acknowledges that they're way, 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 way more liberals than conservatives. They don't see this as a problem. And even when they do see it, as the two people I quoted earlier, they say, yeah, well, it is what it is. No, that's not going to work, because they continue to lose viewers. Newspapers, partly for technological reasons, the internet, but partly for ideological reasons, continue to lose readers. Circulation is down, ratings are down. They're going to become irrelevant before long. And when they do, as I said in the last page of the book, they will blame their critics. I have met people who work the overnight at 7-Eleven serving Slurpees to insomniacs who have more introspection than a lot of journalists I know. And you know what? Let me say one other thing. This is current. There's an editorial in the New Republic, very old, very prestigious, in liberal circles, magazine in Washington, in which they have, the editorial is called RIP, MSM RIP, Mainstream Media Rest in Peace. And they talk about how media is going under, a lot of media is going under. And they actually blame me by name. If I had that kind of power, they would have gone under a long time ago. But they blame Fox, they blame me, and they also blame liberal critics for poisoning the well. Do you see how smart I am? I wrote about this. I used the exact words they did in the editorial, which is out the week of March 4th. I said that that's what they would do. They blame their critics, and it's not going to do them any good. They need to look inward. They need to have a little introspection, or they will become so irrelevant that you would never want me here to speak about the media. It would be a waste of your time. That's where they're heading.
This might be slightly off the subject, but I would really like your opinion. Very recently, I think it was on Cavuto's show, Dennis Kucinich was being interviewed. Now, if you recall, during this whole period that we were throwing money at banks, brokerage houses, and God knows who, the Democrats in Congress, the Barney Franks, et cetera, stated that whenever the subject came up, we were not going to nationalize banks. That was not our purpose, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Dennis Kucinich, about a week and a half or so ago, was being interviewed, and he was asked the question, Barack Obama and the Democrats in Congress have decided that a CEO or any other officer in a bank or any other company receiving government funds was going to have a salary cap at $500,000. Kucinich was asked about this, and was this fair or correct? And Kucinich stood there, pointed, a la Bill Clinton, and said, they had a choice whether they took our money or not.
Right.
You take it, we own you. What's your opinion?
Well, let's not pretend that that a CEO who, when he took over, whose stock was selling at $50 a share and today is selling at $2 a share, let's not pretend that he deserves $20 million a year. Because if anybody else ran their company into the ground, they'd be thrown out. So I think that. But here's what and I also think the following, which is what I'm really glad you asked that, because I want to get to this point. I think these CEOs who don't have a clue and fly in on private jets and accept $20 million for running their companies down, I don't have a lot of use for them, to be honest with you, okay? But the idea that they're being questioned, and not just questioned, what's the word I'm looking for, that they're being talked down to by people who have gotten us $1 trillion in a hole is ridiculous. I hope one of them, just one of them stands up and says, you know, I made a terrible mistake, I admit it. I took your money. Here's your money back, and don't you lecture me about screwing things up, because you guys are the biggest screw-ups in the United States of America.
I don't know if this is.
By the way, let me just say one other
germane-
thing. Let me say one other thing. I think Republicans have to understand the reaction in this room. We don't like it any more than Democrats like that kind of thing. We just don't think Congress, we think Congress is worse. You know, that's the only.
Thank you, sir. I don't know if this is germane to your general subject tonight, but obviously you're well-read and well interspersed. How many magazines do you read and the newspapers, and if you take the time, or is it all internet?
I read a lot of stuff online in the morning just to see what's going on. You know, I get the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal delivered to my house at great expense because the Wall Street Journal, I think, is a great paper, and my wife has to do the crossword puzzle in the Times. So, but there are times when I read the New York Times early in the morning, and you're not going to believe this, but I mean this, my head explodes. So I do go online, and I read a number of columns. I'm a big fan of Charles Krauthammer, you know, and of several people at National Review Online. And I read the liberal columns in the Wall Street Journal. There's a liberal columnist, you know, and I read that stuff too. And then I start the day, you know. But in other words, I want to get a broad range of what people are thinking and talking about.
Bernie, are Rick Santelli and Kramer going to be able to keep their jobs?
You know, I think they will. I'm convinced they will, because if anything happens to either of them, what's the logical conclusion? That we can't have any dissent in this country? I mean, I know they wouldn't be fired by government. It's not a censorship issue, but it would violate the spirit of censorship. You know, censorship only involves what government, you know, prohibits you from saying. If CNBC decided to do something like that, it would be a huge, huge mistake, and I don't think they will. I think they're safe.
Hi, Bernie. Thanks for being here. Yesterday morning, I think it was Rush I was listening to, and I know you said there's no conspiracy, and I believe you, of course. Rush was saying that there's a conference call in the morning from Rahm Emanuel that goes out to George Stephanopoulos and James Carville and Paul
Begala.
Thank you. So is there any, not that I think Rush is lying,
you know what?
but...
I heard about this several weeks ago. For those of you who don't know, there was a story on Politico, which is a very good online newspaper, and then it was picked up by other sites, that says every morning Rahm Emanuel and Stephanopoulos and Begala and Carville talk on the phone and have these chats. I got to be honest with you, I don't know what they talk about. If they're talking guy stuff, you know, what do you think of the football game last night, or yeah, you don't believe they're talking that, do you? Right? And they call me cynical, right? If they're talking just guy stuff, I don't have a problem with it. If they're talking political stuff, and the political stuff entails, well, I don't think you should handle it this way, or I think you should handle it that way, that is so off the charts. You know, the only reason I'm willing to believe it doesn't happen that way, that is outrageous if that were happening. And if it turns out that something like that in fact were happening, and ABC News took no action against their anchor, then every executive at ABC News would have to go. That's why I don't think it's happening. Well, I shouldn't say I don't think it's happening. The honest answer is I don't know what they're talking about. This may surprise you, but I'm not involved in that conference call. But if that is happening, off the charts, unacceptable.
I've heard several economists who have the opinion that because of the depth of the problem with the real estate market, and the size of the loss of value that the average person has, that the only real way out of that mess is by wild inflation. And their prediction is that the government not only would support that, but would do anything in their power to make that happen, because that's the easiest way out. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I'm the wrong guy to ask. I'm not an economist, but I did speak to Dick Morris about that very point. And I'll tell you what he thinks. He thinks 2 years from now, we've got hyperinflation. And housing prices are going to go through the roof, and other commodities will go through the roof, or commodities will go through the roof. I don't know. Again, I'm not an economist, I'm not an expert by any means, but it seems to me that if you're printing money and borrowing money, at some point, you're going to have to pay the price for this. And I think that price is, in fact, going to be hyperinflation. So I think, I think that's probably the logical conclusion to all of this. Now, of course, there's a way to deal with it. You can raise interest rates way up and bring it down, but that will touch off the next recession, which would come right after the next election, by the way, presidential election.
Hello. Is it on? Okay. I write a column in the Los Angeles County Republican Women newsletter. It's called My Bookshelf, and I wrote about bias, and I would like to write about this one next. I do have a question. All those years ago when you were with CBS,
right?
Were you a liberal? Were you a conservative then? And if you weren't a conservative then, when did you see the light?
Right. Good question. Very nice outfit and good question. If you didn't see, she's wearing the red, white, and blue and all that. I grew up in a lower middle class, blue-collar family. My parents thought that Franklin Roosevelt could walk on water, even though he literally had trouble walking on land. It was a solid blue-collar Democratic family. And that's how I grew up. In college, I was one of those people who said if Barry Goldwater gets elected, I'm, moving to Australia. But all people in college are stupid, by and large. And even in Bias, which came out in 2001, the book to which you referred, I described myself as an old-fashioned liberal along the lines of John Kennedy, and then I specifically said not along the lines of Michael Moore or Al Franken, okay? I don't know over time if I move to the right or if liberals move further and further to the left and abandon me. And I tend to think that that's it. I consider myself a conservative now on 2 of the 3 basic issues that define conservatism. I'm as conservative as Rush is on smaller government and lower taxes. I'm as conservative as any conservative on anti-terrorism and national defense. On social issues, I'm libertarian. I don't care. I just don't care what people do. I understand not everybody agrees with that, but what distinguishes me from my old liberal friends is I don't think people are bigots if they believe certain things, like if they're against gay marriage, for instance. Liberals think you're a hater and a bigot if you're against. I say, well, what about thousands of years of history, of religious history? So I'm not like them, but I am libertarian on the matter of social issues. And I think liberals just went further and further and further to the left. And even if I didn't move at all, I'd be playing right field at this point. So.
Mr. Goldberg, we have time for one more question.
By the way, can I just add one little thing to this? Do you know, on the question of torture, I find the debate incredibly superficial. Did somebody say amen? Oh, good. And do you know where I find, let's see if you get this one right. Do you know where I find the most intelligent discussion in the media on the issue of torture? Exactly. Who said that? 24. Did you say that? This is an issue that delves into the nuances of it. I mean, when I hear liberal Democrats say, including people who just became Attorney General and President of the United and people like this say, well, I'm against waterboarding, period. Well, I'm against it 99% of the time. They're against it 100%. I'm against it for litter bugs. I'm against it for jaywalkers. I'm even against it for punishing somebody for something they already did. But please, I wish one of these liberals, my old liberal friends, would tell me, they talk about American values, that's why they're against all torture. Please tell me what American value is being withheld that if we thought by torturing, and I'm putting the word in quotation marks, somebody, we could prevent a city from being exposed to a dirty nuclear bomb. What American value is being upheld by saying, I'm against torture all the time? And what if it is in an American city where 100,000 people may die, but one yellow school bus with 30 fourth graders on their way to the museum? You tell me what American value is upheld by letting that school bus get blown up. I'm sorry, I don't get it. And when the most intelligent discussion about this issue, giving both sides, is on a drama show like 24 and is absent, by and large, from the mainstream media, there is something really wrong about that.
Thank you very much. The small percentage of conservatives who are in the media, how are they treated in those circles? Are they able to speak out and say what they stand for, or are they just silent? That's the first part of the question. Second part of the question, do you hear with any degree of regularity any liberal person in the media who gets what you're saying and who stands up against the bias that is there?
Okay, because I have Newsheimer's, I may ask you to remind me about part of the question again. Basically, the first part is like, what's the reaction to conservatives? Okay. I worked at CBS News ultimately for 28 years before I quit to write bias. But at the 25-year mark, I mean, not a lot of people work for one company for 25 years. I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about liberal bias. I don't think any other mainstream journalist had ever written about liberal bias, certainly while he was still working for a big mainstream news organization. It touched off the media equivalent of World War III. They don't take it well. I called Dan Rather the day before the article came out. He was in Iowa covering the caucuses in February 1996. And I said, Dan, I wrote something that's going to be in the Wall Street Journal tomorrow, and I need to give you a heads up. He said, I don't think you're going to like it. And he said to me, this was 1996. This was how many years ago? 15 years ago? 96, 06? No, 13 years ago. 13 years ago. He said, Bernie, he didn't know what it was about. He said, Bernie, we were friends yesterday. We're friends today. We'll be friends tomorrow. What'd you write? I told him what I wrote, and from that day, yeah. This is too hip a crowd. I don't even have to finish this. From that day in February 1996 until today, I haven't, not a syllable from Dan Rather. So the point is that they don't take criticism well. They need to be able to take criticism better than they do because their survival depends on it. Mine doesn't. I'm doing quite well. They're not doing well at all. And the second part, are there any liberals who speak up? Peter Jennings, may he rest in peace, did acknowledge I believe it was a Boston Globe interview some time ago, that we tend to give certainly more time to liberal voices than conservative voices, but he went further and acknowledged that we sometimes shortchange, you know. But then he would say the next day something that indicates that he didn't think there was any liberal bias. So I didn't know how he felt. But I'll tell you who the best one was by far. By far. Now, you said liberal journalist. I don't know if he was a liberal journalist. That's how good he was. And may he rest in peace, too. Tim Russert. Because Tim Russert, when I wrote Bias, you see, I have no constitutional right to be on anybody's TV show or radio show. So the fact that NBC, ABC, CBS, NPR wasn't really interested, you know, I want to be specific here. CBS and ABC didn't have me on at all, not even at 3 in the morning, even though it was a #1 New York Times bestseller. NBC only had me on after the book slipped out of first place. This was like 20 weeks after it hit the chart. 20 weeks, 5 months, and only if I came on with Michael Moore. Okay? Okay, so I consider NBC as not having me on to talk about bias, because they didn't want to talk about bias. They wanted to talk about how does a book from the right and how does a book from the left reach the #1 spot. So they wanted to talk about something else. Okay, I have no constitutional right to be on any of those shows. I want to make that clear. But Tim Russert had me on right away, and he told me, and bless him for this, he told me that this needed to be read in every newsroom. And he said, he didn't want to use the term political bias. He said, can we use the term cultural bias? I said, absolutely. It's the same thing. Cultural bias is fine with me. He got it. And I wrote another op-ed in the Wall Street Journal when he died. And the point of it was, all these people who are praising Tim Russert, all his colleagues, I don't think they get it. I don't think they get what made him great. It wasn't that he knew more about politics than most people. That isn't what makes him great. What made him great is that he had an open mind, and he was willing to entertain things like cultural bias in a way that his colleagues would not listen to, and bragged about never reading my book, Bias. They bragged about it. They were fiddling while their news organizations were burning, and they continue to lose audience. And they brag about not wanting to read about their own business. Let me say one other thing. Remember what I said earlier about the people who work the overnight at 7-Eleven, who serve Slurpees to insomniacs? They really do have more introspection than most journalists. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.